Georgi Dimitrov, The Struggle for Peace. 1. Never since 1914 has the menace of a world war been so great as it is now, and never has it been so necessary to mobilize all forces to avert this calamity which threatens all mankind. But to do this, one must first of all realize from where the danger is arising, who are responsible for it, and against which countries the attack is being directed. It would not be correct to think that the war which is approaching threatens the Soviet Union alone, or even the Soviet Union in the first place. As a matter of fact, the occupation of the Rhineland by Hitler's armies is a direct threat to France, Belgium, and other European countries. It is also a fact that Hitler's immediate plans of conquest are directed towards the seizure of territories in neighboring countries where there is a German population. Whereas Hitler talks about the quote-unquote sovereignty of Germany, he will talk tomorrow about the so-called sovereignty of all the Germans. Under this slogan, he will try to carry out the annexation of Austria, the destruction of Czechoslovakia as an independent state, the occupation of Alsace-Lorraine, Danzig, the southern part of Denmark, Memel, etc. And this is quite easy to understand. It is much easier for German fascism to send an army first of all to seize the territory of neighboring countries under the slogan of the so-called national unity of all the Germans, and only later to fight against the powerful land of the Soviets. German fascism, in strengthening its positions on the Rhine, also threatens the independence of the Polish people, in spite of the fact that the present rulers of Poland are its allies. As far as the Far East is concerned, there can be no doubt that a direct blow is aimed at the Chinese people, although the fascist military clique of Japan are preparing for a war against the Soviet Union and have an agreement with Berlin for this eventuality. Japan has already occupied Manchuria and is now occupying one province of China after another. Japanese imperialism is striving by this means to subject all the peoples of Asia, including India, and to seize the Philippines and Australia. It is preparing for a decisive encounter with the United States and Great Britain. Hence it is clear that the peoples of the West would commit a fatal error if they allowed themselves to be lulled by the illusion that the fascist warmongers in Europe and the Far East do not threaten them. In particular, the people of the countries neighboring on Germany have food for serious thought regarding the defense of their independence and liberty. As is well known, the fundamental cause of imperialist wars lies in capitalism itself, in its predatory efforts. But in the existing international situation, the instigator of the approaching war is fascism, this mailed fist of the most aggressive and warlike forces of imperialism. The war danger has become so immediately threatening because the road to power was not barred against German fascism at the proper moment. Having obtained power by means of an internal war against the mass of the people of its own country, fascism has grown a direct war menace to the countries of the whole world. Having enslaved its own people, it is advancing with the torch of war in its hand to attack other peoples. The war danger has become extremely menacing for the further reason that the fascist aggressor has been allowed to enjoy a position of impunity. The war preparations of German fascism, the introduction of universal military service, the air and naval armaments, were carried out with the systematic connivance of capitalist powers and the direct assistance of British ruling circles. The passivity and wavering of the League of Nations in regard to the Japanese attack on China and the Italian aggression in Ethiopia encouraged the impudence of the aggressor. But the growth in the aggressiveness of German fascism and of the Japanese military clique is first and foremost the result of the fact that the international proletariat did not succeed in acting unanimously with all the power of its gigantic forces, did not rally around itself all the working people and all the friends of peace into a mighty front against war. The resistance of the reactionary section of the leaders of the Labour and Socialist International and the International Federation of Trade Unions to the united front of struggle has not yet been broken. But the refusal of these reactionary leaders, supporting the imperialist policy of their own bourgeoisie, to undertake united independent proletarian action against war, lulling the masses to sleep with the illusion that the League of Nations would do everything necessary for the maintenance of peace, this has hindered the struggle of the proletariat against war and paralyzed its pressure on the capitalist governments. In addition to the openly reactionary leaders who disrupt the unity of action of the international proletariat in defense of peace, there are also quote-unquote left phrasemongers who propagate fatalistic views to the effect that war is inevitable and the maintenance of peace impossible. Since the fundamental cause of war is capitalism, then, they say, so long as the latter exists, it is impossible to avoid war, and it is hopeless and useless to fight for the maintenance of peace. Such people are out-and-out doctrinaires, if not simply impostors. They see everywhere around them the raging forces of war, but they do not at all notice the mighty factors for peace. The Soviet Union, the country of the victorious proletariat, with its consistent and resolute peace policy, is such a factor for peace. Another factor for peace is the proletariat of the capitalist countries. These are the leading forces in defending peace against the warmongers. The mass of the peasants, all the working people, and the mass of the people in all capitalist countries are also for the maintenance of peace. A number of capitalist countries at present are interested in the maintenance of peace. In the countries where fascism rules, as well as in the countries where the rulers abet the instigators of a new slaughter, the peoples do not want war. Phrasemongering doctrinaires, such as those from the British Independent Labour Party, depict matters as if the question of war and peace depends only on the capitalist governments. Yes, this would be the case if the mass of the people were simply pawns in the hands of the governments and did not fight to maintain peace in spite of their governments. But that is just the point. It is radically wrong to regard the mass of the people as puppets in the hands of the government. If the masses, without whom war could not be carried on, were to act resolutely and promptly against the war plans of the governments, they could force these governments to renounce war and the abetting of war plotters. The whole thing is to organize the struggle of the peoples for the maintenance of peace in good time and to carry it on continually and everywhere against the fascist warmongers and their backers. A united peace front is required, which would include not only the working class, the peasants, the intellectuals, and other working people, but also the oppressed nations and the peoples of countries whose independence is threatened by the warmongers. A peace front is required, extending to all parts of the world, from Tokyo to London, from New York to Berlin, acting in coordination against the warmongers, against German fascism in Europe, against the Japanese military clique in the Far East. And this peace front will become powerful and invincible if it organizes practical mass action, not restricting itself to protests, resolutions, and declarations. By economic and political measures, the warmongers should be put absolutely in a state of siege. They should be cornered in such a way that they are incapable of carrying out their criminal plans. The globe should be encircled with such a network of organizations, of the Friends of Peace, such a mighty movement of international solidarity, and such effective measures of a united international policy of the proletariat for the maintenance of peace, as will effectively tie the dastardly hands of the warmongers. The fascist aggressor must be made to feel most emphatically that his every step is vigilantly watched by millions of people, and that any attempt to attack other peoples will meet with the determined resistance of the proletariat and working people of the whole world. Only the proletariat, uniting its ranks, can be the organizer of such a peace front, can be its driving force, its backbone. This is now the central task of the international proletariat as a whole. The success of the fight against fascism itself also depends on its successful solution. 2. To want peace is not enough. It is necessary to fight for peace. It is absolutely inadequate to carry on general propaganda against war. Propaganda against war in general does not in the slightest degree hinder the conspirators sitting in Berlin or Tokyo from carrying out their dastardly work. They would be quite satisfied if the working class were to go no further than such general propaganda. A successful struggle to maintain peace absolutely requires that the joint activity of the proletariat and the widest masses of the people be directed against the specific instigators of war and against those forces inside the country which help them directly or indirectly. From this point of view, it is extremely important in every country to work out a definite and correct tactical line in the struggle for the maintenance of peace, taking into account the situation of the party and the working class movement of the given country, and also its internal and international situation. In the countries where fascism is in power, the working class, putting in the forefront of its struggle against the fascist dictatorship, exposure of chauvinist demagogy and war preparations, unites all forces to avert the catastrophe into which fascism is preparing to hurl the people. When the proletariat and the masses of the people of Germany, Italy, and other fascist countries fight against the power of fascism and its military aggression, they are acting not only for their own salvation, but in the interests of peace, in the interests of all peoples, of all mankind. A particularly important question now, in the tactics of the working class, especially in the countries which are directly in danger of an attack, is the attitude which should be adopted toward the foreign policy of the government and the defense of the country. To the working class and all working people, it is by no means a matter of indifference what foreign policy the government carries on toward the fascist enemies of peace, whether this policy helps to strengthen collective security or to hinder it, whether the government protects the agents of the fascist aggressors or takes effective steps against them, how it treats sons of the people in the ranks of the army, in what spirit they are trained, what elements the officers of the army are composed of, whether these are reliable in the fight against the fascist enemy or whether they are fascist reactionary elements, how the population is to be protected against the horrors of war, etc. To adopt an attitude of indifference to the question of the defense of the country, to leave this question without control in the hands of a bourgeois government, will not in any case assist the cause of defending peace. It is no accident that the ruling section of the bourgeoisie has always looked upon this sphere as its monopoly, regarding it as a kind of holy of holies. This monopoly of the bourgeoisie must be demolished once and for all. The proletariat cannot get along without its own independent policy on these questions, without on any condition permitting itself to slip into adopting the position of the bourgeoisie. The party of the proletariat must actively interfere in foreign policy and in questions of national defense, advancing its own platform and its own demands. As the supreme supporter of the active defense of its own people and country from fascist enslavement, the working class must closely link up the question of the defense of the country with the demands for the extension of the democratic rights of the workers and peasants and the defense of their vital interests, taking as its starting point the fact that only the democratization of the regime, the democratization of the army, its cleansing from fascist and other reactionary elements, and the satisfaction of the urgent demands of the workers and peasants can strengthen the defensive capacity of the people against the fascist attack. In every concrete situation, the representatives of the working class will support such proposals and will seek to secure the carrying out of such measures as open up the greatest possibility for bringing to bear on the widest scale the pressure of the masses of the people upon the foreign policy of the government, as well as for their effective control over the activity of the government in questions of national defense. They will also support all those measures which hinder the capitulation of the bourgeois governments to the fascist aggressor and the betrayal of the independence and liberty of the people by these governments. In case of a direct threat of war by a fascist aggressor, the communists, emphasizing that only the proletarian power is able to ensure the reliable defense of the country and its independence, as is plainly shown by the example of the Soviet Union, will seek to bring about the formation of a People's Front government. Such a government, taking determined steps against fascism and the reactionary elements in the country, against the agents and backers of the enemies of peace, and ensuring the control of the organized masses over the defense of the country, will assist in raising the capacity of the people for defense against the fascist aggressor. Since today the power is in the hands of bourgeois governments, which are no guarantee for the genuine defense of the country, and which use the armed forces of the state against the working people, the party of the working class cannot take any political responsibility for the defensive measures of these governments, and therefore opposes the war policy of the government and the military budget as a whole. This does not exclude abstention from voting in particular cases, giving the reason for doing so on those various measures of a defensive character which are necessary to hinder the attack of a fascist aggressor, for example the fortification of frontiers, of voting and speaking for measures dictated by the interests of the defense of the population against the horrors of war, gas shelters, gas masks, Red Cross work, etc. The time has gone by when the working class did not participate independently and actively in deciding such vital questions as war and peace. The difference between communists and reformists, between revolutionary and reactionary leaders of the working class movement, is not at all that the latter participate in deciding these questions while we revolutionaries remain aloof. No, the difference is that on these questions, as on other questions, reformists defend the interests of the capitalists, while revolutionaries defend the interests of the working people, the interests of the people as a whole. These flexible Bolshevik tactics, which are the application of the general tactical line of the 7th Congress of the Communist International to a specific question, arise of necessity from the whole present-day international situation, particularly from the existence of definite fascist aggressors. It is really ridiculous when quote-unquote left phrasemongers of various kinds oppose these tactics, adopting the pose of irreconcilable revolutionaries. If we are to believe them, all governments are aggressors. They even quote Lenin, who, during the imperialist war of 1914-18, correctly rejected the argument of the social chauvinists that, quote-unquote, we were attacked and we are defending ourselves. But the world at that time was divided into two military imperialist coalitions, which were equally striving to establish their world hegemony, and which had equally prepared and provoked the imperialist war. At that time there were neither countries where the proletariat had conquered, nor countries with a fascist dictatorship. But now the situation is different. Now we have 1. A proletarian state, which is the greatest bulwark of peace, 2. Definite fascist aggressors, 3. A number of countries which are in direct danger of attack by fascist aggressors and in danger of losing their state and national independence, 4. Other capitalist governments which are interested at the present moment in the maintenance of peace. It is therefore completely wrong now to depict all countries as aggressors. Only people who are trying to conceal the real aggressors could so distort the facts. 3. The peace which exists at present is a bad peace. But in any case, this bad peace is better than war, and every consistent supporter of peace will understand at once the need to support all measures which assist in maintaining it, including the measures of the League of Nations, particularly sanctions. Sanctions can be made into an effective means against an aggressor. If the sanctions undertaken by the League of Nations did not prevent Italy continuing the war against Ethiopia, this is not an argument against sanctions, but against the powers which frustrated their application. And if German fascism today is throwing out a challenge to the peoples of the whole world, this is precisely because it reckons on freedom from punishment, because sanctions were not applied to Japan, because the sanctions against Italy were frustrated by the capitalist states, because finally, when Hitler sent his troops to the frontiers of France and Belgium, he was convinced in advance that sanctions against him would be frustrated by the British bourgeoisie. It is said that the application of sanctions increases the war danger and will lead to war. This is not true. It is just the opposite. The impunity of the aggressor increases the danger of war. The more resolutely sanctions of an economic and financial character are applied to a fascist aggressor, complete refusal of credits, stopping commerce and the supply of raw materials, the less will German fascism be inclined to begin a war, because the greater will be the risk to it. The League of Nations must be ruthlessly criticized for its irresoluteness, passivity, inconsistency. The working class wages an irreconcilable struggle against the governments of those imperialist countries, members of the League of Nations, which help the aggressor for the sake of their own selfish interests, disrupt measures for preserving peace, and sacrifice the interests of small nations to the interests of the big imperialist powers. But it does not follow that we should in general take up a negative position toward the League of Nations. What interest has the proletariat in playing into the hands of the warmongers, all of whom are at present against the League of Nations. The League of Nations has been deserted by the chief instigators of war, Germany and Japan. The League of Nations includes the Soviet Union, which throws all its international weight into the scales on the side of peace and collective security. In the League of Nations, there are also other states that do not want to give the fascist aggressors an opportunity to attack other peoples. Those who cannot distinguish between the League of Nations in the past and the League of Nations at present, those who cannot vary their approach to the different members of the League of Nations, those who refuse to bring mass pressure to bear on the League of Nations and the various capitalist governments to secure the adoption of measures to maintain peace, such people are windbags and not revolutionaries or proletarian politicians. The working class must support those measures of the League of Nations and various states which are really directed towards the maintenance of peace. Non-aggression pacts, pacts of mutual aid against the aggressor, pacts of collective security, financial and economic sanctions. And not only must it support these measures, but by a mighty mass anti-war movement, it must force the League of Nations and the governments of the various capitalist states to take serious steps in defense of peace. It is not true that the policy of constantly yielding to the demands of the fascist warmongers by the League of Nations and by various countries, Great Britain, France, Belgium, etc., can help to maintain peace. The workers have not forgotten that previously in the internal policy of Germany, it was precisely the concessions and capitulation to attacking fascism which paved the latter's way to power. In the international arena, a similar capitulatory policy frees the hands of militant fascism for attack. It is also not true that the cause of peace will gain from attempting at the present moment to raise the question of a redistribution of the sources of raw material, colonies and mandated territories, as the reactionary social democratic leaders are doing. In reality, this is done with the aim of distracting the attention of the masses from a concrete struggle against the warmongers. On the other hand, such proposals conceal the desire to give colonies to German fascism, which is bound to strengthen still more the military position of German fascism. It is not the business of the proletariat to advocate any particular division of colonies and mandates among the imperialists. Its task is to support the struggle of the colonial peoples for their interests and their rights, and for their final liberation from the imperialist yoke. 4. While demanding effective measures from the League of Nations and the bourgeois governments against the aggressiveness of the fascist firebrands, the proletariat must not overlook for a moment that the chief, fundamental and decisive thing in the maintenance of peace is the independent action of the masses in defense of peace against the actual war incendiaries. There cannot be the slightest doubt that if the international proletariat, with its mass organizations, especially the trade unions, had acted in unison and by strikes and other measures had prevented a single ship or a single train going to or from Italy, Italian fascism would long since have been forced to stop its war of plunder against the Ethiopian people. But the formation of a really wide people's front for peace, strong enough to carry on such a struggle against military fascism, is possible only if there exists unity of action of the proletariat itself. It was precisely the establishment of the unity of action of the working class which made it possible for the French and Spanish proletariat to build up a mighty anti-fascist people's front. Torn by internal contradictions, the London Conference of the Labour and Socialist International and the International Federation of Trade Unions, under the pressure of the reactionary wing, evaded the question of the necessity for immediately bringing about unity of action of the proletariat on a national and international scale. This conference did not call upon the working masses for independent action, but limited itself to an appeal to rely wholly on the League of Nations. It did not take a stand in defense of the Chinese people who are being attacked by Japan. It did not condemn in the slightest degree those labor leaders and social democratic leaders who defend the aggressive policy of German fascism, masking this by phrases about the quote-unquote maintenance of peace. But simultaneously, a movement for the united front of the working class is rapidly developing of late in the ranks of the Labour and Socialist International and the International Federation of Trade Unions. The basic interests of the whole international proletariat require that these forces gain the upper hand and overcome the resistance of the opponents to the united front. The fact that fascism, taking advantage of the discord in the parties and organizations of the working class in various countries, has gone over to a military offensive, insistently demands a single international policy of the working class for the purpose of maintaining peace. To sum up, this single international policy of the proletariat can be brought about on the following basis. 1. The restoration and strengthening of real international proletarian solidarity to defend the interests of the widest masses of the working people. The social democratic parties must make a decisive break with the imperialist interests of their bourgeoisie. 2. Every possible support for the peace policy of the Soviet Union, the proletarian state that stands unswervingly in defense of peace among peoples. And this presupposes, in the first place, a determined struggle by the working class parties against the counter-revolutionary attempts to depict the foreign policy of the Soviet Union as identical with the policy of the imperialist states, and to represent the Red Army, that bulwark of peace, as being the same as the armies of imperialist states, attempts which play into the hands of the fascist warmongers. 3. The blow against the fascist aggressor must be directed with definite purpose and with concentrated force at every moment. The attitude taken towards the aggressor must be different from that taken toward the victim of his attack. Any attempt to gloss over the difference between fascist and non-fascist countries must be exposed. 4. An independent struggle by the proletariat for the maintenance of peace, independent of the capitalist governments and the League of Nations, making it impossible for the working class movement to be subordinated to the behind-the-scenes designs of the imperialist governments in the League of Nations. Under present conditions, the fight to maintain peace is a fight against fascism, and this fight is in essence revolutionary. The maintenance of peace is a deadly danger for fascism because, by increasing its internal difficulties, it leads to the undermining of the fascist dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The maintenance of peace helps the growth of the forces of the proletariat, the forces of revolution, helps to heal the split in the ranks of the working class movement. It helps the proletariat to become the leading class in the struggle of all working people against capitalism. It undermines the foundation of the capitalist system and hastens the victory of socialism. Quote, "War may break out unexpectedly. Wars are not declared nowadays. They just start." Unquote. Stalin. But this demands first and foremost that communists have a clear understanding of the extent and nature of the war danger and the ways and means of overcoming it. A decisive step at present toward establishment of unity of action of the international proletariat against the warmongers is for the communist parties of each separate country to develop in all fields of social and political life the most active, persistent, and extensive campaign for the maintenance of peace. The communists will carry on this campaign, not postponing it until pacts for joint activity have been signed with the leaders of the social democratic parties, but they will unfailingly carry it on from the point of view of the struggle for the establishment of unity of action between the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party. Communists will exert every effort to overcome the resistance of the reactionary social democratic leaders to the united front and to strengthen in every way the bonds of joint struggle against the common enemy between the communist and social democratic workers. Such a campaign, helping to draw the communist and social democratic workers closer together, will help to activize and rally all the forces of the proletariat, not only on a national but on an international scale. This will greatly assist setting into motion other strata of the working people of town and country, the masses of the petty bourgeoisie, peasants and intellectuals, all friends of peace. All this will hasten the formation of an invincible front of struggle of the international proletariat, of all toiling people, of all peoples, for the maintenance of peace. The struggle for peace is a struggle against fascism, a struggle against capitalism, a struggle for the victory of socialism throughout the world.